The Philosophy of God. Part 1. Whatever may be said against philosophy as an instrument for construction, it is certainly valuable when we come to deal with the unconscious dogmatism into which men of science are apt to fall. Is there a God? Can we know that there is a God? And can we prove that there is a God? These are practical questions, since in the light of an affirmative or a negative answer, all human affairs must be understood and regulated. They are questions perhaps more, and certainly not less, opportune now than any other period in the history of the human race. For the age in which we live is one of the strictest investigation and of the most searching criticism. Nothing, no doctrine, theory, or opinion is excluded from it. History, science, philosophy, theology, all alike must make good their assertions or be rejected. Theory, hypothesis, and statement, coming from no matter what source, are dragged before the bar of human reason to render an account of themselves, and nothing can long escape the merited censure that cannot clearly and straightforwardly make itself approved to the mind. A highly significant and noteworthy change is taking place in the modern scientific teaching and in modern philosophy. The first is seen to be abandoning positions which, a few years back, it claimed to be impregnable. It is progressing, and as it registers and tabulates the results of its researchers, it dogmatizes less, speculates less widely, is more anxious to join its forces to those of that same philosophy that it formerly stigmatized as a mere tissue of word weaving, and an anti-progressive brake upon the wheel of advance. The science of the 20th century is realizing more and more its descriptive function. It is going back to its old and far more exact methods, and it is looking to philosophy as to separate department of thought based on other foundations and pursuing other methods than its own, for a solution of the great problems that the existence of the world sets before every thinking mind. And philosophy in its more recent forms and aspects is drawing closer to the path in which it originally trod. The convergence of modern thought, of both the purely scientific and the philosophical, upon the ancient lines, appears to be more remarkable when we recollect how utterly those lines were obliterated by the destructive thought systems introduced since the decadence of scholastic philosophy. Even now, the old principles are almost entirely unknown to those new explorers who are steadily and apparently quite unconsciously drawing closer to them. It is difficult to suppose that any one system of philosophy could be begun and perfected by an individual. The completed system as we know it has invariably been the work of a school, the result of many tentative efforts. And thus, when we discover, as indeed we do in the literature that gives expression to the mental attitude of the day, that a vital current is running through the stream of modern thought towards a philosophy that has twice at least occupied the unique position of being practically universal, and a philosophy that has never ceased to exert a very great influence upon the thinking world, we are with some reason encouraged to hope that it has set in the right direction. More than this, modern philosophy is notably fitting itself in more closely with the common sense of those thinking men who are not philosophers by profession or habit. It is abandoning the shallows of crude materialism into which it was forced by thought systems that are passing out of vogue, and it is leaving the thick mist of an idealism in which it seemed to have no real sustainability and certainly exerted no marked influence on mankind as a whole. Still, great and fundamental changes such as these, which seem to be working themselves out towards a definite end, do not take place quickly. An individual may place an old with a new theory in a day, but as a general rule, even the growth of theory into the popular esteem is slow, and the final modifications of systems require many years of patient labor, during which not a few workers contribute their quota to the final result. This is indeed one of the best safeguards that a theory or system can have while it is still in the making. Isolated investigation, testing, corroboration, correction, the opposition of counter theories, all these go towards establishing it upon a sound basis. A basis strong enough to justify its popular adoption, so long as it explains the facts it professes to explain, and while it is not contradicted by other certain truth or newer and incompatible facts. In the infancy of the exact sciences, it was natural that the discoveries that were made and the hypotheses that were framed should receive a difference altogether disproportionate to their true value in the totality of knowledge. Now that science has grown older, adding enormously to her store of facts, their truer worth is being perceived. The more the possible vistas of science are opened up, the more is the need of a general reconstructive philosophy realized, to coordinate and explain the vast mass of facts and records coming from all the sciences in one coherent thought system. The experimental scientist who until a comparatively recent date announced his latest discovery to the world with a great blare of trumpets and drew from it the most far-reaching theoretical conclusions with a confidence as astounding as it is as naive, is now for the most part contented with the modesty chronicling and cataloguing his facts, or at most perhaps indulging in a little harmless speculation concerning them. For the modern scientist is learning the humility of knowledge. He begins to realize that his one science alone is insufficient, and indeed, properly speaking, does not attempt to explain the true natures and reasons of things. The philosopher is now more tentative than dogmatic, and more critical than constructive. He too is learning his lesson, the humility of wisdom. The truth of the matter is that the scientist and the philosopher both realize that neither can do without the other, and the attempt to solve problems appealing to them both as men with equal force. They must work hand in hand. And consequently, the scientist is giving up his attempt to construct an ideal interpretation of the world from the limited materials at his disposal, just as the philosopher is striving to bring his guiding principles into closest touch with the recorded facts of the exact sciences, and thus the inevitable result is slowly but surely being sought about. The gap caused by the divorce of science and philosophy, and widened by their respective progress on either side along the totally divergent lines, is being filled by the mutually related contributions of both. To what precise final theories this fusion of sciences will lead? What system will be born anew from this union of forces? It is difficult to predict with any semblance of certainty, but it is safe to say that materialism of the one will go far to tone down the hazy idealism of the other, while the same idealism will help to raise the purely materialistic solution of the problems to a new and more intellectual plane. We shall have a true thought system related to all the results of exact experiment, which will be at once idealistic and materialistic. It is fairly safe to say that it will be a realistic thought system in the best sense of the word, as the perfection and continuation of the realism of common sense. In any case, whatever the outcome may be, the noteworthy tendency to be observed at present is towards a system of philosophy as old in its general outline and construction as that of Aristotle. But a fact of perhaps yet greater importance still remains to be noticed. The problems that for centuries have been almost, though by no means altogether, out of the reach of the masses, have now become so vulgarized that there is hardly anyone, or even moderate attainments, who ignores them. The very pretensions of the attacks that have been made upon philosophy from time to time in the name of science have possibly done more than all else to awaken a new interest in the old questions. And while some of the guesses and the hypotheses of the sciences, useful enough in their proper place, but falling short as explanations of reality, have had the effect of confusing the real problems, they have at any rate raised them afresh. The keen interest taken in the most fundamental questions of philosophy and in the latest and most up-to-date discoveries of science is by no means confined now to the study of the man of letters or to the laboratory of the chemist or biologist. Perhaps one of the most encouraging of the many encouraging signs of the times is the enormous and intelligent interest taken by the ordinary man and woman in these questions. Knowledge is no longer the monopoly of the scholar. If he requires a monopoly, he must turn to his learning, for knowledge has set up her throne at every street corner. In the school, the free library, the daily paper, the working man finds his academy and his cursus philosophicus. And he has every right to knowledge, for his reason is essentially the same as that of the scholar. His intellect, though possibly not so highly trained, is quite as capable of dealing with the common problems. He only lacks the opportunities, the leisure, and the sometimes cumbrous apparatus of critical learning. It is unfortunate that philosophical writers have clothed their teaching in a language which is difficult for him to understand. Perhaps to some extent this was inevitable. What is more unfortunate is that conflicting schools and popular usage have rendered common terms so ambiguous and common phrases so misleading, but only express a philosophical truth in words which he does understand, and his intelligence has no difficulty in grasping its import. For nature has made him fundamentally a philosopher, and if lack of education has deprived him of a firm grasp and a deep knowledge of the medium of thought, he is not a grammarian in the old sense of the term. His ideas in most cases are as accurately, though perhaps not as comprehensively formed as those of his more fortunately circumstanced fellow men. His principal difficulty consists not in forming an idea or understanding it when formed, but in formulating and expressing in it, or abstracting it from words. Of course, it is not for a moment to be supposed that all men, without any distinction, have the same comprehensive grasp upon a deep insight into the principles and conclusions of philosophy. Such a statement would be manifestly false. But what is meant is that if philosophical truth is only suitably expressed, it is calculated to appeal as much to the unlearned as to the learned. The intelligence of each is at its root precisely the same. Truth does not merely consist in words. The child come to the age of reason grasps the idea of first principles as quickly as the man does, and he understands their truth in precisely the same manner. Only since all this is received is fashioned and shaped to the capacity of the recipient, there is ample room for an indefinite number of cases in which the content of knowledge differs in extent and intensity. And so the aim of philosophy is not to produce faith, nor to enforce its teaching by the mere authority of its teachers, but to induce knowledge in its learners by simply showing them the inherent reasonableness of its first principles, and by allowing them to perceive for themselves the real strength and value in the proofs it employs. In laying stress upon these considerations, which scarcely amount to more than truisms, no attempt is made to minimize the very real difficulties in the way of becoming proficient in such a science as philosophy. Like the acquisition of any other form of knowledge, it has many obstacles in its path. There is here no royal road. For philosophy, it may be observed, on account of the extremely abstract treatment of its subject which it employs, demands even more careful thought and painstaking study than any other branch of natural science. But even so, it is not necessary to have probed to that depth of all the questions to which speculation has given birth, in order to have a sufficiently clear and accurate insight into principles which are sufficient to our intellectual and moral guidance. It is not necessary to have made a deep study of science in order to recognize certain of its truths, and it is not necessary to be deeply acquainted by metaphysics in order to perceive the certainties with which this science deals. We are not asking how, but is there a God? And these are quite different questions. After all is said and done, the demonstrations are valid or they are not. The conclusion drawn from them is true or untrue. And if the lines of reasoning are valid and the inference correct, the thinking man or woman, and those to whom even the labyrinth of philosophical speculation is as yet entirely unexplored, for whom its technical terms and phrases present a more or less foreign and unknown appearance, have precisely the same intellectual nature as the keenest and most profound philosopher, and one has every right to trust to this in presenting any set of demonstration that lays claim to being conclusive. The force and logic of the proofs advanced will appeal to the reason if the proofs are valid and the arguments sound. If for any reason one particular line of proof fails to convince, another may perhaps appeal with more direct force to the individual's intelligence considering them all. The reader to whom the mechanical thought, if the expression may be allowed, of formal logic is not so familiar, and for those whose mind and any metaphysical ideas involved seem at first glance to be beyond comprehension, ought to bear in mind, however, that the formal ordering and arranging of proof always presents some such apparent difficulty. Until a certain facility is acquired by training and study, we must perforce employ our natural logical faculty and more or less rough and ready, though always substantially correct, metaphysics. The warning is merely by way of a caution, for the natural faculty is generally quite trustworthy, unless it has received a false bias from without. The study of mathematics presents similar difficulties which are overcome by careful and exact thought on the part of the learner, and the mathematical conclusions are in a sense more difficult to reach than those with which we have to deal with here. For the mathematical sciences deal with a particular form of abstract thought, while metaphysics, though more abstract than mathematics, lies at the very foundation of all our thoughts. It is the logic and the metaphysics of nature, then, that are really the important factor in any deep investigation. A little attention will soon dispel any difficulty, if it exists, and make the reasoning clear. And if the formal arrangements of the proof does seem somewhat hard and dry, the importance of the conclusions is more than enough to justify the labor involved in reaching them. Please join us in our next chapter as we continue to study on the importance on the subject of the God of philosophy. In our next series, we'll be looking at the first principles, which are real and ideal orders, sensation, and causality. Join us as we continue our study on this subject. Thank you.